I don't know when you'll read this, but I can tell you when it began. It was a walk in the woods when the entity came for me. It wasn't a blur, it was, for lack of a better term, the absence of meaning. Where it hid, there were no trees. As Alaric crept closer, there was no grass. Through the arc it left for me, there was no breeze, no air at all. When it struck, I felt claws puncturing me somewhere unseen, somewhere I'd never felt before. My hands, arms, legs, and torso seemed fine. I wasn't bleeding, but I knew I was injured. As I fearfully ran back home, I felt less. I was vaguely tired, and it was hard to focus. The early solution was simple. A big cup of coffee helped me feel normal again. The subtle drain of my essence became lost in the ebb and flow of caffeine in my system. You could say my life began that week. That was when I met Mar. We got along great. To be honest, I think I fell in love with her over the phone before we even met. It was almost as if the strong emotions of that first week made the entity fight back. It was still with me, latched onto some invisible part of my being. The first few incidents were minor. I hardly worried. The color of my neighbor's car changed from dark blue to black one morning. I stared at it before shaking my head and shrugging off the difference. 2 days later at work, a coworker's name changed from Fred to Dan. I asked around carefully, but everyone said his name had always been Dan. I figured I'd just been mistaken. Then, as ridiculous as it sounds, I was peeing in my bathroom at home when I suddenly found myself on a random street. I was still in my pajamas, pants down, urinating in full view of a dozen people at a bus stop. Horrified, I pulled up my clothes and ran before someone called the cops. I did manage to get home, but the experience forced me to admit that I was still in danger. The entity was doing something to me, and I didn't understand how to fight back. Mar showed up that evening with her own key. "Hey," I asked in confusion, "how'd you get that key?" She just laughed. "You're cute. Are you sure you're okay with this?" She opened the door and entered a room full of boxes. I know living together is a big step, especially when we've only been dating for 3 months. Living together? I'd literally just met her the week before. The thing was, Mar always called me a smart cookie for a reason. I knew when to shut my mouth. Instead of causing a scene, I told her everything was fine and went straight to my room to investigate. My things were just as I had left them, with no sign of a 3-month gap in habitation. But I did find something out of the ordinary. The date. I shivered angrily as I processed the truth. The entity had eaten 3 months of my life. What the hell was I facing? What kind of creature could consume pieces of one's soul like that? I had missed the most exciting part of a new relationship and would never understand any shared stories or inside jokes from that period. Something absurdly precious had been taken from me, and I was furious. That fury helped suppress the entity. I never indulged in alcohol and drank coffee religiously. I checked the date every time I woke up for 3 years. I managed to live each day, observing only minor alterations. A social fact here and there, someone's new job, the number of kids they had, the layout of nearby streets, the time my favorite television show aired, those kinds of things. Always, those changes reminded me that the creature's claws were still sunk into my spirit. For 3 years, I never let myself zone out. But one day, I grew careless. I got engrossed in the season finale of my favorite show. It was gripping, a fantastic story. Right at the height of the action, a young boy came over to my lounger and shook my arm. Surprised, I asked, "Who are you? How did you get in here?" He laughed and smiled brightly. "Silly daddy." My heart sank. I knew immediately what had happened. After a few masked questions, I discovered that he was 2 years old. He was my son. The agony and heartache filling my chest were nearly unbearable. Not only had I missed the birth of my son, but I would also never know the first years of his life. Mar and I had obviously gotten married and started a family in the time I had lost, and I had no idea what joys or pains those years contained. It was snowing outside. Holding my son, I stared out the window and watched the flakes fall. What kind of life was this going to be if slips in concentration cost me years? I had to get help. The church had no idea what to do. The priest didn't believe me and told me I had a health issue rather than some sort of possession. The doctors had no clue either. Nothing showed up on their scans and tests, but they happily took my money in return for nothing. By the time I ran out of options, I decided to tell Mar. There was no way to know what this all looked like from her side. What was it like when I wasn't there? Did I still take our son to school? Did I still do my job? Clearly, I did because she seemed to be none the wiser, but I had a horrible feeling that something must have been missing in her life when I wasn't actually home. Inside my own head. The night I set up a nice dinner in preparation, she arrived not by unlocking the front door, but by knocking on it. I answered to find her in a nice dress, happily surprised by the setting on the table. A fancy dinner for a second date? I knew you were sweet on me. Thank the Lord I knew when to keep my mouth shut. If I had gone on about being married and having a son, she might have run for the hills. Instead, I took her coat and sat down for our second date. Through carefully crafted questions, I managed to deduce the truth. This really was our second date. She sought relief from happiness in me, but interpreted that as dating jitters. I was just excited to realize that the entity wasn't necessarily eating whole portions of my life. The symptoms, as I was beginning to understand them, were more like the consequences of a shattered soul. The creature had wounded me, broken me into pieces. Perhaps I was to live my life out of order, but at least I would actually get to live it. And so it went on for a few years. From my perspective, while minor changes in politics or geography would happen daily, major shifts in my mental location only occurred every couple of months. When I found myself in a new place and time in my life, I would just shut up and listen, make sure to get a lay of the land before doing anything to avoid mistakes. On the farthest flung leap, I met my 6-year-old grandson. I asked him what he wanted to be when he grew up. He said a writer, and I told him that was a fine idea. Then I was back in month 2 of my relationship with Mar. I had the best night with her on the riverfront. When I say the best, I mean the best. Knowing how special she would become to me, I asked her to move in. I got to live through what I had missed the first go-around and came to understand that I was never mentally absent. I would always be there eventually. When we were moving her boxes in, she stopped for a moment and said, "Shima, you are my great love," as if I had known her for a lifetime and never once doubted she was the one. That was the first time I truly laughed freely and wholeheartedly since the entity had wounded me. She was right about my love for her, but not for the reasons she thought. I had known her my whole life in a fragmented, disjointed way. I had come to terms with the situation and found a twisted peace with it. It wasn't so bad to have sneak peeks at all the best parts ahead. But of course, I wouldn't be writing this if it hadn't gotten worse. The entity was still with me. It hadn't wounded me and departed like I wanted to believe. Instead, it burrowed deeper into my psyche, fracturing it into smaller pieces. Instead of months between major shifts, I began having them weekly. Once I noticed that trend, I feared my ultimate fate would be to jump between times of my life heartbeat by heartbeat, forever confused, forever lost, only an instant in each moment. I would never be able to speak with anyone else, never hold a conversation, never express or receive love. As the true depth of that fear dawned on me, I sat in an older version of myself and watched the snow falling outside. That was the one constant of my life, the one that didn't care who I was or what pains I had to face. Nature was always there. The falling snow was like a hook that kept me anchored. The pure, emotional peace it brought was like a balm for my mental wounds. I had never yet shifted while watching the pattern of falling snow, thinking of the times I'd gone sledding or built a snow fort as a child. A teenager touched my arm. "Grandpa, huh?" He startled me out of my thoughts, so I was extra careful. "Who are you?" I asked, unsure if I was joking or not. Handing me a stack of papers, he said, "It's my first attempt at a novel. Would you read it and tell me what you think?" "Of course," I said, pursuing that dream of being a writer, I see. He blushed bright red. "Trying to anyway. All right, run off. I'll read this right now." The words were blurry and annoyed. I looked for glasses I probably had for reading. Being old was terrible, and I wanted to leap back into a younger year, but not before I read this book. I found my glasses in the sweater pocket and began leafing through it. From the corner of my eye, I saw family members milling in and out of the living room. It seemed we had relatives over. Was it Christmas? A pair of adults and a couple of kids I didn't recognize trooped through the hallway. I saw my son, now an adult, walk by with his wife on their way out the door. The extended family began sledding outside. Finally, I finished reading the story and called out to my grandson. He rushed down the stairs and into the living room. "How was it?" "Well, it's terrible," I told him truthfully. "But it's terrible for all the right reasons. You're still a young man, so your characters behaved like young people, but the structure of the story itself is very solid." He paused, then said, "I didn't expect it to turn out to be a horror story." I nodded. It's a reflection of the times. Expectations for the future are dismal, not hopeful like they used to be. You're far too young to be aware like that, I told him. Then an idea occurred to me. If you're into horror, do you know anything about strange creatures? Sure, I read everything I can. I love it. Wearily, I scanned the entrances to the living room. Everyone was busy outside. For the first time, I opened up to someone in my life about what I was experiencing, in hushed tones. I told him about my fragmented consciousness. For a teenager, he took a while, his eyes widening with disbelief. "You're serious?" "Yes." He donned the determined look of a grown man. "I'll look into it and see what I can find out. You should start writing down everything you experience. We need data. Maybe we can map your psychic wounds." "Wow, sounds like a plan," I said, surprised that made sense. I hadn't expected him to have a serious response. "But how will I get all the notes in one place?" "Let's come up with somewhere for you to leave them," he said, thinking hard. "Then I'll get them, and we can trace the path you're taking through your own life. See if there's a pattern." For the first time since the situation had worsened, I felt a glimmer of hope. "How about under the stairs? Nobody ever goes under there." "Sure," he nodded and left the living room. I peered after him, hearing him banging around near the stairs. Finally, he returned with a box, laying it on the carpet and opening it to reveal a bursting stack of papers. "Holy crap!" he exclaimed, though being a teenager, he didn't really say crap. Taken aback, I blinked rapidly, forgiving his cursing because of the shock. "Did I write those?" He looked up at me with wonder. "Yeah, you will. You still have to write them and put them under the stairs after those." He gazed back down at the papers, then covered the box. "You probably shouldn't see what they say. It could get weird." That much I understood. "Right," he gulped. "There are like 50 boxes under there, all filled up like this. Deciphering these will take a very long time." His tone dropped to dead seriousness. "But I will save you, Grandpa, because I don't think anybody else can." Tears flowed down my cheeks, and I couldn't help but sob once or twice. I hadn't realized how long I'd been in my shifting prison of awareness until I found someone who understood. Thank you so much." And then I was young again, at work on a random Tuesday. Once the sadness and relief faded, anger and determination replaced them. After I finished my work, I grabbed some paper and began writing. While the weeks shifted around me, and then days, and then hours, I wrote every single spare moment about when and where I thought I was. I put the notes under the stairs, out of order. My first box was actually the 13th, and my last box was the 1st. Once I had over 50 boxes written from my perspective, but once my shifting became a matter of minutes, I knew it was up to my grandson to take it from there. I put my head down and stopped looking. I couldn't stand the river of change and awareness any longer. Names, places, dates, jobs, colors, people were all wrong and different. I've never been older. I sat watching the snowfall. A man of at least 30, whom I vaguely recognized, entered the room. "Come on, I think I finally figured it out." I was so frail that moving was painful. "Are you him? Are you my grandson?" "Yes." He took me to a room filled with strange equipment and sat me in a rubber chair facing a large mirror twice the height of a man. The pattern finally revealed itself. "How long have you worked on this?" I asked him, aghast. "Tell me you didn't miss your life like I'm missing mine." His expression was both stone cold and furious. "It'll be worth it." He brought 2 thin metal rods close to my arm and then nodded at the mirror. "Look, the shock is carefully calibrated." The electric zap from the device was startling but not painful. In the mirror, I saw rapid arcing lights through the web of hair above my head and shoulder. Electricity moved through the creature like a wave, briefly revealing the terrible nature of what was happening to me. A bulging, leech-like mouth was wrapped around the back of my head, coming down to my eyebrows and touching each ear. Its elongated body ran over my shoulder and into my very soul. It was a parasite feeding on my mind. My now adult grandson held my hand as I took in the horror. After a moment, he asked, "Removing it is going to hurt very badly. Are you up for this?" Fearful, I asked, "Is Mar here?" His face softened. "No, not for a few years now." I could tell from his reaction what had happened, but I didn't want it to be true. "Have we had this conversation a lot?" he responded. "Are you sure you want to know? It never makes you feel better." Tears brimmed in my eyes. "I don't care if it hurts or if I die. I don't want to stay in a time where she's not alive." He made a sympathetic noise of understanding and then returned to his machines, hooking several wires and other bits of technology to my limbs and forehead. While he did so, he talked. "I've worked for 2 decades to figure this out, and I've had a ton of help from other researchers of the occult. This parasite doesn't technically exist in our plane. It's one of the lesser spawns, and it feeds on the plexus of mind, soul, and quantum consciousness. When details like names and colors of objects changed, you weren't going crazy. The web of your existence was merely losing strands as the creature ate its way through you." I didn't completely understand and looked up in confusion as he placed a circlet of electronics like a crown on my head, in exact line with where the parasite's mouth had drained me. He paused his work, looking pained. "I forget that you wouldn't know. You're lucky, believe me." After a deep breath, he began moving again and placed his fingers near a few switches. "You ready? This is carefully tuned to make your nervous system extremely unappetizing to the parasite, but it's basically electric shock therapy." I could still see Mar's smile, even though she was dead. I had just been with her moments ago. "Do it." The click of the switch echoed in my ears, and I almost laughed at how mild the electricity was. It didn't feel like anything, at least at first. Then I saw the mirror shaking, and my body with it, convulsing. Oh no, it did hurt. Nothing had ever been more painful. It was just so excruciating that I hadn't been able to immediately process it. As my vision shook and fire burned in every nerve in my body, I could see the reflected trembling lights in the web of the parasite on my head. It writhed in agony equal to mine. It had claws 6-clawed, lizard-like limbs under its leech-like body, and it dug into me in an attempt to stay latched on. The electricity made my memories flare. Mar's smile was foremost, lit brightly in front of a warm fire as the snow fell past the window behind her. The edges of that memory began lighting up, and I realized that my life was one continuous stretch of experience. It was only the awareness of it that had been fragmented by the feasting evil on my back. I never managed to be there for the birth of my son. I jumped around it a dozen times, but never actually lived it. For the first time, I got to hold Mar's hand and be there for her. No, that moment shifted seamlessly into holding her hand as she lay in a hospital bed for a very different reason. Not this. God, why was it so merciless to make me remember this? I broke down in tears as nurses rushed into the room. I didn't want to know. I didn't want to experience it. I'd seen other good parts, but I hadn't wanted the worst part, the inevitable end that we all would face one day. It wasn't worth it. All that joy, tainted 10,000-fold by pain. The fire surged through my body and brain, searing me with sheer white torture. I screamed, a scream that faded into a surprised shout as the machine's electricity and the chair disappeared. Snow was no longer falling around my life. I was in the woods on a bright summer day. Oh God. I turned to see the creature approaching me. It was the same absence of meaning, the same blank on reality. It crept forward just like before, but this time it hissed and turned away. I stood, astounded to be young again and free from the parasite. My grandson had actually done it. He'd made me an unappetizing meal, so the predator abandoned me, searching for a different snack. I returned home in a daze. While I was sitting there, processing all that had happened, the phone rang. I looked at it with a mix of awe and sadness. I knew who it was. It was Marv calling me for the first time, for some trivial reason she'd admit 30 years later was made up just to talk to me. But all I could see was her lying in that hospital bed, dying. It was going to end in unspeakable pain and loneliness. I would become an old man, left to sit by myself in an empty house, his soulmate gone long before him. At the end of it all, the only thing I would have left was sitting and watching the falling snow. But now, thanks to my grandson, I would also have my memories. It would be a wild ride, no matter how it ended. On a sudden impulse, I picked up the phone and, with a smile, asked, "Who's this?" Even though I already knew. Author's note. Together, my grandfather and I set out to write the tale of his life. But unfortunately, his Alzheimer's disease progressed rapidly, and we were never able to finish. He's still alive, and I imagine that mentally he's in a better place in the nursing home. I like to think he's back in his younger days, living life and being happy. Because the reality is much colder. It's snowing today. He loves the snow. When I visited him, he didn't recognize me, but he did smile as he stared out the window.